The guillotine waits. Its blade, sharpened to perfection, catches the pale light of a Parisian morning. The wood beneath it is slick not with dew, but with the residue of countless lives ended here. The crowd surges, one body pressing against another, the stench of sweat and smoke rising into the air like a fever. They do not whisper, they roar. 200,000 voices, all fused into one monstrous hymn of hatred, of relief, of vengeance. And at the center of this storm lies a broken man, Maximilien Robespierre. His jaw is shattered, half his face swaddled in filthy bandages, stained black with dried blood. Each breath rattles like a saw dragged across bone. He cannot speak, and that silence is crueler than any iron chain. This was once the voice that dictated life and death in revolutionary France. Now he can only gurgle the blood in his throat, mocking the eloquence that once moved a nation. You hear the drums, a rolling thunder meant to drown out the screams, but they cannot hide his suffering. The executioner approaches, indifferent, his hands steady. He tears the bandages away. A scream bursts from Robespierre's mangled jaw, a sound no one had ever imagined, neither word nor cry, but a shriek of raw animal pain. The crowd explodes, not with pity, but delight. Some leap upon benches, waving hats, their eyes alight with the cruel joy of seeing terror itself destroyed. The blade rises, its steel glints like a final judgment. For one long moment time slows. Robespierre's eyes, fever bright, dart across the horizon. He sees no allies, no friends, no sympathy. Only faces, countless faces, gazing upon him as though he is a monster finally trapped in the cage of fate. The blade falls. The sound is not clean. It cracks through the air like a thunderclap, then slams into wood. His head tumbles blood arcs in the sunlight, and the crowd roars as if Paris itself had been reborn. What should have been a moment of solemnity becomes a grotesque festival. Drums, cheers, and laughter smother the silence of death. Yet beneath the roar lies a question, a chilling one. How does a man who began as a quiet provincial lawyer, a man who once denounced the death penalty, transform into the architect of slaughter, sending thousands to this very blade? How does the champion of virtue become its executioner and finally its victim? This is not merely the story of Robespierre. It is the story of how power corrodes ideals, how fear becomes the iron law, and how justice once weaponized turns on its master. To understand the festival of his death, we must return to the theatre of his life. To the moment when he rose cloaked in virtue, speaking of liberty, and to the moment when those words began to curdle into blood. Paris in 1793 was not merely a city, it was a crucible. In its streets, the stones themselves seemed to tremble beneath the cries of liberty and vengeance. And at the heart of this storm stood Maximilien Robespierre, not yet broken, not yet despised. To the people, he was incorruptible. His modesty was legendary, no mistresses, no luxury, no bribes. He wore simple clothes, lived simply, spoke of virtue with an almost priestly devotion. Where others sought riches or glory, he sought purity. Robespierre had not been born into power. He was the son of a provincial lawyer raised far from the glitter of Versailles. His education was his weapon, his voice, his blade. In the early days, he opposed the death penalty itself, standing against the savagery of the ancien regime. He believed reason, not fear, would guide men into a just society. Yet fate is cruel, and revolutions devour even their purest children. The revolution accelerated. The king fell. The monarchy collapsed, and blood began to soak the cobblestones of Paris. In this chaos, the Committee of Public Safety was born. It was not merely a council, it was a machine, and Robespierre was its soul. From its chambers came decrees that shaped the fate of millions. His speeches in the convention rose like sermons, promising salvation through vigilance, virtue through sacrifice. Crowds packed the galleries to hear him. Mothers named their children after him. To oppose him was to oppose the revolution itself. Yet the serenity was false. Behind the curtain of devotion, the machinery of death was assembling. Guillotines rose in every major city. They gleamed like new altars promising justice in steel. And Robespierre, though he had once abhorred them, now defended them as instruments of virtue. He spoke of the guillotine as a necessary guardian, a sword that cut away corruption so that liberty might flourish. The irony was brutal. The man who dreamed of ending executions became the one who expanded them to an industrial scale. Still in 1793, his image remained untarnished. In the eyes of the people, he was a savior. Artists painted him as a prophet of the Republic. Newspapers praised his incorruptibility. His colleagues in the committee deferred to him, even feared his calm authority. He carried no sword, no musket, yet men trembled before his words. In salons and taverns, whispers spread, "Robespierre is the revolution." But the air was heavy. Beneath the triumph, beneath the applause, a shadow began to stretch. His vision of virtue was absolute, unyielding. And when virtue is demanded, not inspired, it becomes tyranny in disguise. The theatre of power had been built, the lights burning bright. The audience cheered their incorruptible hero, but already cracks were forming in the stage. The play had only just begun, and tragedy was waiting in the wings. The applause never lasts. What begins as reverence soon curdles into suspicion, and suspicion becomes terror. For Maximilien Robespierre, the incorruptible prophet of virtue, the first cracks appeared almost invisibly, like hairline fractures in marble, delicate at first, but fatal in time. He had always lived with an intensity that bordered on obsession. His days were filled with speeches, his nights with drafting decrees. But now the work no longer ended. He slept barely 3 hours, rising in the dark to scribble furious notes repeating phrases like holy incantations. The Republic of Virtue will triumph. Again and again, the same words etched into paper, as though writing them could bind reality to his will. He carried a pistol everywhere, not the weapon of a soldier, but of a hunted man. Friends noticed how often his eyes darted toward shadows, as if expecting conspirators in every corner. He spoke less of liberty, more of betrayal. And in his voice grew a new edge, icy, brittle, paranoid. In the chambers of the committee, once his sanctuary unease began to grow. Colleagues who had fought beside him now felt his gaze weigh upon them like a sentence. The mere act of questioning a decree could be branded treason. A careless word over wine might lead to the scaffold. In the galleries, citizens cheered his thunderous speeches, but behind closed doors, fear spread. Even his allies began to shrink away. Georges Couthon once, his loyal companion, watched in silence as Robespierre raged against invisible enemies. Saint-Just, the angel of death, still defended him, but with a severity that only deepened the dread. Those who had once admired Robespierre's calm incorruptibility now saw a man consumed by visions, possessed by virtue, turned venom. Outside the guillotine sang its daily hymn. In Paris alone, thousands marched to death. In Lyon, the slaughter was so vast that firing squads and mass drownings replaced the blade. The revolution could not keep pace with its own appetite for blood, but Robespierre insisted it was necessary. Necessary to cleanse, necessary to purify, necessary to defend the Republic from corruption, and yet the whispers grew louder. Was it justice, or was it madness? The incorruptible no longer appeared unshakable. He appeared haunted. The man who had once defended the sanctity of life now seemed to see only traitors, only corruption, only death as remedy. Parisians still applauded him in the convention, but their eyes told another story. Behind every cheer lurked unease. Behind every smile, a calculation. How long before he names me a conspirator? The stage was set, the cracks visible now. His speeches, once instruments of hope, were becoming daggers of suspicion. His colleagues watched silent but seething. And in silence they began to dream not of liberty, not of virtue, but of escape. The incorruptible was becoming untouchable, and a man untouchable is a man doomed. The summer of 1794 was heavy with the scent of blood. Paris awoke each morning to the creak of carts filled with the condemned, the steady beat of drums escorting them to the guillotine. Execution was no longer spectacle, it was routine, a ritual of steel and sawdust. In some cities, the machinery of death could not keep pace. At Nantes, barges of prisoners were chained together and drowned in the Loire, their cries swallowed by the river. It was as though France itself had become one vast slaughterhouse, and at its centre sat Maximilien Robespierre. To him it was all necessary. The revolution must be defended even against shadows. He thundered in the Convention that corruption was everywhere, that enemies cloaked themselves in patriotism. His voice no longer lifted spirits, it condemned them. The Republic, he declared, must be cleansed. Cleansed meant only one thing, the blade. But terror is a double-edged sword. Those who wield it too freely often cut themselves. His colleagues began to see their own faces in his words. Deputies who once applauded his speeches now heard their death sentences echoed between the lines. When Robespierre thundered about purging corruption, who could say with certainty that he did not mean them? On the night of July 26th, he gave a speech more furious than ever. He railed against traitors, but named none. This vagueness was more terrifying than direct accusation. Each man in the chamber felt the blade suspended above his neck. Murmurs swelled into silent vows. If Robespierre lived another week, many of them would not. The next morning, July 27th, the convention gathered. Tension clung to the air like smoke. Robespierre, pale and exhausted, tried to speak. His enemies moved swiftly. A deputy denounced him. Another shouted him down. Then another. The chamber thundered with cries. Tyrant, dictator. The incorruptible was no longer untouchable. Robespierre's voice, once enough to command a nation, was drowned in the storm. He stood trembling, insisting on his purity, but the words struck no chord. Instead, the convention voted his arrest. The gavel struck like a coffin lid. In that moment, the trap was sprung. Soldiers seized him along with Saint-Just and Couthon. The same guards who once marched at his command now led him away like a criminal. Crowds, sensing the shift, jeered. They no longer feared him. They rejoiced. For Robespierre, the fall was dizzying. Yesterday, he was the high priest of virtue, the arbiter of life and death. Today, he was a prisoner, his fate sealed by the very mechanism he had perfected. Terror had turned upon its architect. The machine of virtue, once his weapon, had decided it would devour its master. And as he was led to prison, a silence fell over him. Perhaps for the first time he understood he was not the director of this theatre. He was the next actor in its fatal play. The prison walls closed around him like a tomb. Once Robespierre had walked freely through the halls of power, his words echoed by crowds, his decrees carried out in every corner of France. Now he sat on a wooden bench in a damp cell, his only companions, the faint drip of water from stone, and the shuffle of guards outside his door. The silence was heavier than chains. He had always been surrounded by Saint-Just, his angel of conviction, by Couthon, his crippled ally with unshakable loyalty, by deputies who trembled at his gaze. But now even they were scattered. Saint-Just sat in another cell, equally condemned. Couthon, unable to walk without help, lay helpless on the prison floor. Robespierre, the incorruptible, was left alone with his thoughts. And thoughts were crueler than executioners. The man who had once commanded thousands now clutched scraps of paper, scribbling feverishly as though words could rescue him. His hand shook ink, blotting into black stains. But what could be written that would undo years of blood? He had outlawed mercy, silenced opposition, demanded purification. Now the silence answered back, and no decree could break it. Sleep, when it came, was no refuge. His dreams were feverish parades of faces, faces he had sent to death. Nobles, priests, generals, peasants, women, even children. Eyes wide with accusation, mouths opening but never speaking. They circled him in silence, a jury of the dead. He awoke gasping. His shirt soaked with sweat, the dark cell offering no escape. When he pressed his hands to his temples, the pain was unbearable. His mind, once razor-sharp, was now a labyrinth of paranoia. Every sound beyond the bars was a whisper against him, every footstep a signal of betrayal. He had demanded that France live in virtue, but now he realized virtue had left him deserted. Even the guards mocked him. Some spat near his feet. Others laughed when he tried to speak. They had watched the cartloads of victims pass daily through Paris, their faces drained of hope. Now they looked at him with grim satisfaction, the executioner turned prisoner. And yet, deep within a flicker of defiance remained. He still believed, even in this cage, that he was right, that his vision of virtue was pure, that the Republic needed cleansing, that corruption demanded blood. But the belief no longer had weight. It rang hollow against stone walls. Loneliness is not merely the absence of others, it is the collapse of meaning. The sudden recognition that the theatre has emptied, the stage is dark, and your voice, no matter how loud, echoes back, only to yourself. Robespierre sat in that silence, stripped of allies, stripped of power, stripped of the illusion that he was eternal. The lonely battle had begun, and he would fight it with nothing but his own failing body and the ghosts of a nation he had drowned in blood. There is nothing more cruel than watching a man reach for remedies that do not exist. Robespierre had built his authority on the claim that he alone could cure France of corruption. But in the final hours, his cures were as hollow as the echo of his name in the prison corridors. His allies whispered advice through barred doors. Write another speech, send another decree, denounce your enemies once more. But words could no longer serve him. His voice, once the sharpest weapon in the revolution, had dulled to silence. And in this silence, he turned inward, clinging desperately to the tools that had once saved him his ideals, his faith in virtue, his belief that terror was medicine. The irony is grotesque. Just as physicians of the era bled their patients in a vain attempt to drain sickness, Robespierre had bled France in the belief that he was healing it. Day after day, the guillotine drained the nation, each head another dose of his brutal prescription. But like those misguided doctors, he had only worsened the fever. The patient, the Republic, was sicker than ever, and now its surgeon lay on the operating table awaiting the very knife he had wielded. Even as guards mocked him, he scribbled notes as if new laws might spring him free. He muttered of conspiracies of purity of justice. His handwriting, once elegant and precise, was now jagged, streaked with blots, like wounds across the page. He still believed that if the people heard him, they would rally. But the people no longer listened. They had turned his cure into a disease in their eyes. Outside, the streets were buzzing with grim relief. For months, markets had stood half empty. Families had starved. Citizens had vanished overnight. Now whispers spread that with Robespierre's fall, life might return. Merchants set out baskets of fruit. Children dared to play in the alleys. Bakers lit their ovens before dawn. His enemies knew the truth. France was already healing, and the doctor was irrelevant. Inside his cell, however, Robespierre fought on in futility. His remedies were not poultices or prayers, but the same rigid convictions that had led him here. He rehearsed speeches he could no longer deliver. He clung to the phrase that had become his gospel, "The Republic of Virtue will triumph," but the words fell limp, hanging in the stale air like dying embers. The cruelest cure came not from him, but from fate. In a desperate scuffle at the Hôtel de Ville, as soldiers stormed the hall, a pistol fired. The bullet tore through his jaw, shattering it. In one instant, the man who lived by words was robbed of speech. His last and greatest instrument was destroyed, and with it every chance of persuading, condemning, or saving himself. Robespierre had always believed terror was a remedy. Now he discovered what every condemned soul before him had known: terror is not medicine. It is only poison, and he had swallowed it whole. The night before his death was not filled with dignity, but with silence broken by the wet rattle of his breath. His jaw hung in tatters, bandaged hastily with rags, already stiff with blood. Each attempt to swallow sent shocks of pain through his body. He could not eat, could barely drink. The man who had once stood in the convention for hours without pause could now only groan like an animal wounded beyond saving. In those hours, the world outside his cell shifted. Paris was electric with anticipation. Citizens crowded taverns whispering of the fall of the tyrant. Markets opened as if spring had come overnight, as if the air itself were cleaner without his presence. Bread that had been scarce reappeared on tables. Mothers laughed as their children played freely, unafraid of the midnight knock that had haunted their doorways. For the first time in years, the city seemed to breathe. But inside, Robespierre knew only suffocation. He lay on his cot staring at the damp stone-ceiling lips, trembling with unspoken words. His fingers twitched as though still tracing the cadence of speeches he could no longer deliver. Guards came and went, some sneering, some indifferent. None offered comfort. His once loyal Saint-Just sat in another cell, pale and unbowed, still believing in their cause. But they were separated, each left to die alone. When dawn came, there was no ritual, no solemnity. The jailer brought him what passed for a final meal: bread, water, perhaps a morsel of meat. He could not take it. The food sat untouched, the smell of it sharp, almost mocking. Hunger was nothing beside the pain of his ruined mouth. He had spoken of virtue as nourishment for the soul, but now he faced death starving, denied even the simple dignity of a last bite. At noon the carts arrived. Prisoners were gathered, loaded like cattle. Robespierre was lifted into one, his body frail, his face a mask of agony. Beside him sat Saint-Just Cousson, and others men who had once commanded armies now reduced to silence. The wheels groaned as the cart rolled through the streets, and the people of Paris lined every corner. Some spat, some shouted curses, others laughed. To them this was not execution, it was deliverance. Robespierre sat slumped, his eyes darting desperately from face to face. Perhaps he searched for one trace of pity, one flicker of sympathy. None came. The revolution he had tried to sanctify with blood had abandoned him entirely. By evening, the cart reached the square. The guillotine loomed black and towering, its blade gleaming in the setting sun. The crowd was immense. 200,000 souls pressing forward, eager to witness the end of a man who had made them live in fear. His last hours had ended not in reflection or redemption, but in the most brutal loneliness, a silence deeper than any speech, and a hunger that no bread could satisfy. The square was a furnace of bodies and noise. 200,000 Parisians crammed shoulder to shoulder, their sweat and breath rising in a cloud over the Place de la Révolution. Drums beat like the pounding of a monstrous heart. The guillotine, tall and grim, dominated the stage. Its blade gleamed polished not by reverence, but by relentless use, the steel stained faintly pink from the thousands who had fallen before. Today, it would claim its architect. The prisoners were brought forth one by one. Saint-Just walked with eerie calm, as though defiance itself was a form of immortality. Couthon crippled had to be carried. Each met their end quickly, the blade slicing clean, the crowd roaring. But it was Robespierre they had come to see. When his turn came, silence rippled through the mob. The man who had spoken of virtue, who had turned suspicion into law, now shuffled forward with his hands bound. His face bandaged, his jaw hanging grotesquely. He tried to stand tall, but every step was agony. Blood seeped anew from the wound, soaking through linen dripping down his chest. The executioner seized him. With a violent motion, he ripped away the filthy bandages. The wound was exposed raw and blackened, and from it burst a scream, a shriek torn from what remained of Robespierre's throat. It was not a human cry of defiance, but an animal howl of pain, unformed primal. The crowd erupted. Some clapped, others danced, hats flew into the air. Paris had come to devour its tormentor, and it did so with joy. Dragged up the steps, he was forced onto the wooden plank. The guillotine creaked as it was prepared. He struggled faintly, not against the blade, but against inevitability itself. His eyes, wild and gleaming, swept the crowd. Perhaps he searched for mercy for one familiar face. He found none. The plank dropped. His head was locked in place. Above the blade hung suspended, silent, merciless. For a single moment, all of Paris seemed to hold its breath. Then the drums rolled thunder across the square. The lever was pulled. The blade fell with a crash like lightning striking wood. His head was severed, lifted high, blood spraying against the boards. The crowd roared not with horror but with exultation. Some laughed, some wept with joy, some leapt upon benches as though witnessing the dawn of a new world. What should have been a solemn moment of death became carnival, a grotesque festival of triumph. The smell of blood was heavy, metallic, suffocating. Flies gathered instantly, drawn to the warmth. His body twitched in the basket, lifeless yet trembling in its last spasms. The executioner raised the head aloft, and 200,000 voices exploded as one. The incorruptible was no more. Yet in that instant, the scene was not merely an execution. It was a reflection of the revolution itself, once born of noble ideals, now reduced to spectacle and slaughter. The man who had made death into theatre had been cast as its final actor. His curtain call greeted not with silence, but with savage applause. The roar of the crowd still echoed through Paris long after the blade fell, but when the last cry faded, a strange silence settled. It was as if the city had exhaled for the first time in months. The very air seemed lighter, though it still carried the metallic tang of blood. The terror collapsed overnight. The prisons, once bursting with men and women awaiting execution, opened their gates. Families reunited in tears on the cobblestones. Merchants who had shuttered their stalls returned to the markets. Breadfruit and wine reappeared, and the people tasted life again. It was as though the death of one man had lifted an iron weight from the entire nation. Yet behind this collective relief lurked cold revelations. Robespierre had promised that terror was only temporary, a medicine to purge corruption. But his death revealed how fragile the machinery truly was. The Committee of Public Safety, once feared as omnipotent, crumbled within days. The deputies who had cowered beneath his glare now denounced him as though he had never held power at all. Terror had not been an inevitable force of history. It had been the obsession of one man, and when he fell, the system collapsed with him. Historians who later combed through his papers found pages filled with fevered repetition. The Republic of Virtue will triumph, again and again scrawled as though mantra could replace reason. His paranoia was no illusion. He had truly seen enemies in every shadow, conspiracies in every silence. What he called vigilance was closer to madness. More chilling still was the discovery of how many deaths had been unnecessary, how many accusations had been fabricated or exaggerated, simply to feed the machinery of fear. The guillotine had not defended liberty, it had consumed it. Dossiers revealed that thousands had been executed not for crimes but for words or even for silence, mistaken as disloyalty. The Republic of Virtue unveiled was nothing more than a kingdom of suspicion where survival depended on chance. Doctors, too, examined his final wound. The shattered jaw that silenced him was no clean break. Splinters of bone had driven deep into flesh, leaving him to drown slowly in his own blood for 14 hours before the execution. The man who had wielded words like swords was denied even the dignity of speech in his final day. Fate itself seemed to mock him, stripping him of the very power that had elevated him. And in that grotesque symmetry lay the unveiled truth. Terror cannot be controlled. It consumes its creator as surely as its victims. Robespierre had believed he was building a republic of purity, yet his fall exposed it as a republic of blood. The mask was torn away, and what remained was not virtue, but a stage littered with corpses, his own among them. The guillotine was silent now, its blade at rest, its wood stained with the memory of a nation's delirium. Yet though the machine no longer sang its echo, lingered carved into the conscience of France. Robespierre's body was gone, carted off like so many before him, but his ghost remained haunting, accusatory, unresolved. In the days that followed, Paris hummed with a strange mixture of relief and unease. The markets filled laughter, returned to the streets, and families embraced loved ones freed from prison. But beneath this rebirth lay the scars of suspicion. Neighbours who had once denounced each other in whispers now crossed paths in silence, unable to forget the betrayals that terror had demanded. The revolution's promise of fraternity had been poisoned. The blood on the cobblestones was not so easily washed away. For historians, Robespierre became a puzzle of contradictions. He had entered the revolution as a lawyer who condemned the death penalty, a man who believed in the sanctity of life. He had risen as the incorruptible prophet of virtue, only to drown his ideals in rivers of blood. He sought purity, but enforced it with fear. He dreamed of a republic of virtue, but left behind a republic of ghosts. His downfall was not simply political, it was the collapse of an idea, the proof that virtue enforced by terror becomes indistinguishable from tyranny. And yet, the legacy of his death was not only horror. The end of the terror forced France to confront the cost of its ideals. No longer could executions be celebrated as justice. The guillotine, once hailed as a tool of equality, was seen for what it truly was, an altar of fear. The revolution, scarred and chastened, slowly moved towards stability, but it carried forward the lesson that justice cannot survive when it is wielded as a weapon. Even today, Robespierre's ghost asks questions we cannot easily answer. Can purity ever be enforced without corruption? Can power ever be trusted when it claims to act in the name of virtue? How thin is the line between justice and vengeance, between leadership and tyranny? His story is not simply history, it is a mirror. Stand before that mirror, and you will see not only Robespierre, but every age where ideals are twisted into violence, where fear is dressed as morality, where leaders justify cruelty with words of salvation. The guillotine may be gone, but its shadow stretches long across centuries, reminding us that when justice becomes theatre, when death becomes policy, the blade will always in the end turn back upon its master. The echo of drums, the roar of the crowd, the scream torn from a broken jaw, they still linger. And they leave us with one final, unanswerable question if virtue demands blood to survive. Was it ever virtue at all?